Hello, Mage fans, and welcome to Reality Deviant Book Club. This is the show where you'll hear from those of us who believe reality is a contract, and we didn't sign it. We're going to discuss entries from the recommended reading list in Mage books and tell you if they're worth your time. I'm your host, Adam, and I'm joined again by co-host Puka. If you're looking for thoughtful, intelligent discussion of books recommended by Mage authors, you should probably keep looking. But if you want to hear us talk about a book, you click the right link. I have not heard anything from our podcast producers since the last show. Terry said something about him washing his hands. Hygiene is important. If you like rants and problematic content, you won't have to wait long. Mage the podcast's legal team states, opinions expressed on Reality Deviant Book Club really do not express the views of Mage the podcast. In fact, you probably shouldn't listen to these guys at all. Well, what would we do without a legal team? In our last episode, we discussed Sandman by Neil Gaiman. Puka and I had to leave a lot of our notes on the cutting room floor. If you can find Puka on the Discord server for Mage the Podcast, he just might share some gems with you. I regret not mentioning the one-off Sandman book, The Dream Hunters. The first edition came out as a text story with lush illustrations by Yoshitaka Amano. It is based on a story written in Japan around the 1100s. Grab a copy if you can. This is our fourth episode in a row covering comic books. What's with the fixation? Well, Puka has some knowledge on comics, and I enjoy hearing from him. Also, comics are visual, don't take long to read, and are thus very accessible for a large number of people. Ideas for your Mage games can be harvested easily. I admit I like books with pictures in them. Reality Deviants are known for going off on tangents. Here's one. Thinking of taking your players to the realm called the Hollow Earth? I wrote a blog post giving my reading list to help storytellers bring the Hollow Earth to life. The link will be in the show notes. Before we discuss today's book, I wanted to share my thoughts on another book. Disappearing Through the Skylight by O.B. Hardison Jr. is recommended in the first edition rulebook and Book of Mirrors. Stuart Wick called it a great look at how times are changing and people along with them. This book doesn't justify its own episode, so I'll mention it briefly here. Published in 1989, it claims to be an examination of how culture has changed from 1900 to 1989 and how the differences have resulted in different people almost 100 years later. I disagree with Stuart Wick. I don't think it's a great book. I think it is a poor one. The author wanders away from the premise for most of the book and doesn't address it well at the end. The first 6 chapters address how changes in science have created changes in how people view the universe. However, it isn't a century of changes in science, but more than 2,000 years. This section is quite interesting and would help a storyteller who wants to create new factions of mages based on alternate scientific views of the universe. It gives us insight into a section of the first edition rulebook on pages 42 and 43, where it states technocrats hate dreams and make efforts to avoid having them when they sleep. I am confident this was inspired by the second chapter of Disappearing Through the Skylight, where the author explains Sir Francis Bacon thought the capacity for dreams, imagination, poetry, and metaphor hindered humanity from accurately observing the universe and pursuing science. Bacon apparently wanted to remove these qualities from humanity to benefit society. The following 32 chapters are quite dull. The author tells us at great length about his favorite examples of architecture. He shares frighteningly bad poetry and modern art photos and then praises them profusely because they don't make sense. Art that can be understood or appreciated by more than a few scattered experts, like the author, is inferior, according to the author. After repeatedly banging my head on my desk to keep myself awake as I slogged through this book, there were a few interesting ideas in the last few pages on artificial intelligence. The author is convinced artificial intelligence will awaken, lose interest in humanity, and live in space to avoid us. What did I like about this book? The first 6 chapters. Where did it fall short? The following 32 chapters. Did it give me ideas for running or playing Mage? No. Did it give insight into the world of Mage? Well, the first few chapters helped me understand how Stuart Wick envisioned the technocracy. Did it inspire me to change how I run Mage? No. Does this belong on the recommended reading list? For those wanting to explore the first edition's setting and concepts, read the first 6 chapters. For the following 3 editions of Mage, no. I didn't inflict this book on Puka, I can only push him so far. Enough distractions, time for our main topic. The Books of Magic is a comic book from DC Vertigo that started with 4 issues written by Neil Gaiman with art by John Bolton, Scott Hampton, Charles Vess, and Paul Johnson. Subsequent issues had different people working on them. We're focusing on those first 4 issues which came out in 1990 and 1991. They were collected into a graphic novel in 1993. This graphic novel is recommended in Book of Worlds, Book of Mirrors, and Isle of the Mighty. All 3 of those books are from Mage's second edition. The Mage writers did not say anything specific about the book when they recommended it. The story revolves around Timothy Hunter, a 12-year-old boy in 1990s Britain. He is destined to become either a great practitioner of magic like his ancestor, Tim the Enchanter of Monty Python and the Holy Grail fame, or a great scientist. The mysterious phantom stranger recruits 3 other men well-versed in magic to tell young Timothy of the important choice before him and what it means. The 4 men in turn teach the boy about topics necessary for a basic understanding of magic and its possible dangers. Other practitioners of the occult have also learned of Timothy's fate and send assassins after the boy. Timothy's new tutors must protect him during his lessons. At the story's end, Timothy makes his choice, although his failing to read Destiny's fine print brings a surprise. The Books of Magic is not only an enthralling story, but a rare roll call of DC Comics' mystic characters. Heroes and villains from the 1930s through the 90s make appearances. Timothy's 4 tutors include Dr. Occult from 1935, the Phantom Stranger from 1952, Mr. E from 1980, and John Constantine from 1985. The 4 tutors are called the Trenchcoat Brigade when Constantine makes a wisecrack. That name became popular with DC Comics readers and is well remembered today. I've compiled a list of the DC characters and the dates they first appeared in comics. I'm tempted to share it, but I'll hold off because Puka hasn't shared his thoughts yet. Before we get to our questions, Puka, do you have any thoughts to add on Books of Magic?
I do. I have many thoughts, but I'll just say, if anyone forgot that Sandman and its spin-offs, of which this is one, were located solidly in the DC universe, here you go. It's interesting to me how some of these comics that we think of nowadays as being, standalone properties with their own unique worlds were at first launched and supported by these mainstream superheroics kind of companies. So Books of Magic leans way into it because it was conceived as a vehicle for DC's mystical characters. So in addition to the Phantom Stranger and Dr. Occult, we also get Zatanna and Dr. Fate, and with Constantine, you have the new and popular characters in the mix too, not to mention all of the Sandman Easter eggs and connections, because this was running concurrent with that series. And as a reminder, Gaiman developed Sandman itself out of a defunct DC hero from the Golden Age of comics, so I think it's a testament to his abilities that he's able to pull off a similar trick here, taking these disparate, really, frankly, B-list and C-list characters and turning them into a robust series of its own. In terms of its possible inspirations on Mage, I think there's also kind of a meta inspiration to point to, because consider how the plot is basically 4 sorcerers, or whatever you want to call them, show up to educate someone about magic, which they do with a mix of exposition and adventure. The tone reminds me a bit of the narrative voice in certain Mage books, of which Book of Worlds is certainly one, where you have this in-character, very direct and very comprehensive explanation of some aspect of the world of darkness. So Book of Worlds has that conceit of being a book in universe as well as the book that you are holding and reading. They present the world of Mage in this get all the info out now way that's typical for a role-playing game book, but I think it would come across as odd in a novel. It's weirdly expository, but it works better in a graphic novel. So it's just a parallel that I was thinking of.
Puka, what did you like about this book?
Oh, so much. I do really enjoy this series. I think probably what stands out to me is how everyone seems to be like, don't do magic. It's not worth it. That's kind of a recurring trope. The main supporting characters, or some of them at least, are ultimately manipulating Tim into taking up magic, so they're a little bit more reserved about that viewpoint, but not by much. Near the end of Volume 4, we get the succinct line that magic has a price, and Tim is reluctant to pay it because he's seen by then where it's gotten all of these people that he's met. Mage uses the metaphor of the bitter road to talk about the journey to ascension, but we don't always see much evidence of that in games. So this series is filled with viewpoints and metaphors about what magic signifies, and so many of them, it seems unclear that pursuing magic is really worth it. That's postmodern fantasy at its finest, and I'm completely a sucker for it. So, like his peers in the comics industry at the time, Gaiman also regularly breaks the dichotomy of good and evil in his work, and this is no exception. Characters are brusque, mysterious, amoral, sometimes violent. There's little indication of who's supposed to be a hero, and I'm a fan of these gray area characters, the epitome of which shows up in the person of John Constantine, who gets all the best lines of the series. One of those lines speaks to this point overall, where Tim asks, "Are you sure you're one of the good guys?" And John responds, "There aren't any good guys and there aren't any bad guys. There's just us, people, doing our best to just get by." It's a level of, I don't know if humility is the word, but it's a kind of self-awareness that's refreshing. John spells it out, but it's an idea that surfaces again and again. And that's part of what makes Zatanna in particular stand out so much when she shows up, because she's not like that at all. So having that kind of contrast, but ultimately these characters that occupy a not quite good, not quite evil space is something I really appreciate. And of course, because it's a graphic novel series, I have to mention the art. Each of the 4 issues, as you said, has a different illustrator, and I think I'm quite pleased with all of them, even though they each bring something different to the table. Gaiman pushes the boundaries, literally setting up interesting things with panel structure with what he asks his artists to depict, and they rise to the challenge. My favorites are probably John Bolton's work in issue 1, and then Charles Vess's distinct storybook style in issue 3, but I like all 4. I have to imagine it was a treat, albeit also a headache, to illustrate any one of these.
I enjoyed the story and creativity. Interesting scenes and characters are found in every chapter. The dialogue is Gaiman at his best, and I don't doubt there are several lines a Mage storyteller would want to steal. Chapters 2 and 3 were my favorites. The lush illustrations and coloring of Chapter 3 make me want to pick the book up again and again. The clever twist at the end really was clever. Tim returns home after turning down magic and finds that he regrets his decision. He discovers it isn't too late, though. We learned Tim did have a choice, but it was actually made before he thought it was. I also like early in Chapter 3 where Timothy needs to come up with a name for his new female guide. His quick thinking nets him a perfect name, and his guide tells him it isn't raw mystic power that makes a good wizard. Quick thinking does. This reinforces one of the notions from Mage books that raw power isn't what determines success for mages, but quick wits and flexible thinking. What I like the most about this book is how useful it was to me. When I was running Mage in the 90s, several times a new player asked me what the game was about. I loaned them my copy of Books of Magic and said, "It's all here." Mages start out as regular people, then discover magic. They have a shadow society and make efforts to keep its secrets. They visit magical lands called the Umbra. They watch out for supernatural beings and guard themselves from new enemies. It's like a crash course in Mage for the first 2 editions of the game. It works well for Mage 20 also. So, Puka, where did this book fall short for you?
I am going to come back later to the thing you just said about the human aspect, but yes. In regards to what I was saying before about tone and the similar feeling that I have reading this as I do to reading Mage books of a certain type, I found Tim's acceptance of the situation and willingness to go along with it quite sudden. And it's something that kind of bothers me when you see the hero's journey call to action kind of thing in these sorts of books. Maybe the magically inclined primed to say, "Sure, I'll go explore an other world with you, you tall trench coat wearing stranger." I don't care if they can turn yo-yos into owls and everything. That choice, and spoiler, as you said, this is the choice with capital letters that Tim makes early on to accept magic. It shouldn't be taken without some reflection, or at least I'd want to see inner monologue, backstory, something that gives a sense of who Tim is before he falls into this crash course. The first arc of the ongoing series that comes after this miniseries fleshes him out a lot more as a person rather than just a character, and I would have liked to see more of that here. So then, I also felt the exposition didn't really get fully laid out for us clearly, or for Tim either, until we meet Zatanna about halfway through book 2. So little of the why is explored early on. Why does Tim matter? Why are people after him? Why does he have this power, and why do others care what he does with it? We get partial answers and hints of partial answers scattered through the books, but not much concrete information or really much resolution, just snippets with a few connections between them. I guess that kind of echoes his character journey in a way, but it is a little bit frustrating as a reader when you've only got so many pages left and you're longing for some of that foundation to make sense of the choices the protagonist is making. Part of me wants to excuse that because of the medium, But there are plenty of comics writers, including Gaiman himself in other works, who take the time and space for the reader to truly understand why people are making the choices they did. Maybe a miniseries is particularly tough in that regard. I don't know. The angle specifically about a price on Tim's head or people being after him drags things down in this way. So again, why do so many powers care about his future and his choices regarding magic? And who are they? There's a whole side quest subplot where his mentors go off to India and apparently defeat this group called the Cult of the Cold Flame, who are out to get Tim. But we really only get a couple of panels and allusions to describe that battle. I think it's sensible because the core of the story is Tim's education, so I don't want to be sidetracked by that. But then I question why it was necessary to have it in the first place. I'm more fond of stories about the growth of someone with great potential, but without a great destiny. Maybe because I'm a millennial, I don't know. Or if Gaiman is going to have him be a figure with a great destiny, I want it to be clear to the reader, if not Tim himself in the story, how his mentors factor that knowledge into their plans. We see like a single prologue scene and a single epilogue scene where the hint of this comes up, and a scene in Volume 4 where Tim directly confronts his own potential future, and that brief mention of the side quest, and that's about it. 90% of the book is just the rest of it with what's one lesson after another, and Tim wandering through spaces filled with people more powerful than he is. And to me, there's enough drama in there without the additional conflict to kind of divert the reader. But in the end, that diversion is only 10%, so maybe, I don't have to waste too much time worrying about it.
I really like this book, but I feel there were a few shortcomings. Although the writer did a good job of portraying the risks and costs of magic, he did a poor job of showing the benefits. Chapter 1 especially made magic look depressing and pointless. Why couldn't we hear more about what people accomplished with magic? What made the price worth paying? Also, I felt like using magic to fight evil was belittled. There are several mentions of DC characters that protected people from supernatural threats for decades in the comics, but they felt like failures or were dismissed as having only opposed what they thought was evil. I don't see what Tim learned by seeing possible futures in Chapter 4. He knew things could turn out many different ways, so how does he learn caution by seeing negative outcomes? The exchange between Tim and his father towards the end was silly. It portrays a life without magic as dull and repetitive, but the book didn't convey that message. A life without magic is less chaotic, but it isn't meaningless. It made Tim's final decision less impactful. My final criticism is for art direction. The different artists for the 4 chapters was great, but it would have worked better if the artist for chapters 1 or 2 had done the scenes on Earth for chapters 3 and 4. It would have helped the different scenes stand out better for the reader. Puka, did this book give you any ideas for running Mage?
A few. Obviously, you could use this as the basis for a prelude about a mage on the cusp of awakening, especially if they're like a wild talent. With the caveat that I think even a set of mage character creation prelude questions from the core book will give you more depth than Tim gets in here. So, Gaiman's great at having an idea on every page that I could see how to port into a game. So, you've got body hopping and ostensibly time-traveling ghosts that give warnings. You've got Zatanna using backwards talking like her father as a goofy kind of instrument to deploy. You've got those unstable futures to deal with for any mages who have too many dots in the time sphere, although your threshold for too many dots in the time sphere may be different from mine. As much as I wanted also more context for these assassins coming after Tim, it's great that they just popped up out of nowhere. Awakened assassins in a mage game are no joke and can be good triggers for a story. In particular, I also want to point to the depiction of fairyland in Volume 3. I'm pretty sure this deeply informed conceptions of the dreaming in Changeling the Dreaming, but I think you could apply a lot of it to the Umbra as well. So have gateways from one world to another whose rules to open you need to figure out and follow exactly. Don't just let people step sideways without having to do some work. Throw in some Umbrood who like to do riddle contests. Make up long-winded names for wonders on the spot. One of my favorite moments, too, is when they meet True Thomas keeping watch over the sleeping body of King Arthur, and he talks about how Arthur is kind of all of the slumbering kings at once, and Thomas himself is all of the bards keeping watch. They're kind of these archetypes that take different forms depending on where they're found and who encounters them. We get a Variation on this again in Volume 4, when Tim and Mr. E meet these tarot figures at the end of time, and they seem to almost be the totality of the universe collapsed down into this handful of characters. I don't know if that's getting too Jungian or something, but when I think about what spirits represent in the Umbra, it's that essential thing that is all things, or the Platonic ideal, maybe. I don't know all the philosophy terminology, but that kind of idea. One last thing related to those gateways with rules: give each umbral realm its own rules. If I recall correctly, Werewolf the Apocalypse does this a little bit more directly, where the Umbra has its overall way that it works, but it doesn't mean that places within it can't have more rules of their own, with Umbrood compelled to abide by them. As Titania says when they're in Fairyland, rules are rules, and even though she's the queen of fairy, she too is still bound by them. The same can hold true for reality zones on Earth within the broader set of rules that make up consensus. I think that playing around with these is a great way to modulate the tone of a game and keep players guessing.
I already said there are a lot of lines of dialogue storytellers may want to borrow for their NPCs. A storyteller could probably get a lot of mileage from this book for a new character prelude. We see mentors introducing themselves to a potential mage and explaining magic. Rather than a 10-minute prelude, this book could help you make that introduction into a number of game sessions. Although Baron Winter was a minor character, I see a lot of potential in developing his duties. The time sphere is too often seen as a tool for peering into the past and future and speeding oneself up. What about supernatural occurrences related to the time sphere? A faction might appoint a player who knows time at level 2 or higher to take responsibility for phenomena or visitors related to that sphere. Perhaps there's a node or chantry strongly associated with time, and the player is assigned there. Preventing or playing host to time travelers or redirecting natural time events into harmless channels could inspire any number of game sessions. The Boston Brand character, known as Deadman in other DC Comics titles, made several memorable appearances. He temporarily possesses a random bystander, speaks to Tim, and then quickly departs. What if after using a powerful wonder, the players can only use their sphere magic if they possess a bystander? If they move too far away from their own unconscious body, they are forced back into it. Or players think they've returned safely to Earth from the Umbra only to discover they are invisible spirits. They have to possess someone and return to the Umbra to properly free their bodies. If they can't use spheres over level 1 in the borrowed bodies, you will have an interesting puzzle for your players to solve. Puka, any insights into the world of Mage?
So for this question, I pulled a quote from each issue that I think are nice and instructive for my thoughts on this. In Volume 1, page 43, in the context of talking about the death of magic, which suspiciously parallels the timeline in the World of Darkness, the Phantom Stranger tells Tim, "Science is a way of talking about the universe in words that bind it to a common reality. Magic is a method of talking to the universe in words that it cannot ignore. The two are rarely compatible." I like that as a succinct presentation of the tension between what mystics and technocrats stand for, whether you buy into that or not. It's one viewpoint among many possible within the game, but I think it's probably the core tension that Mage as a game embraces in terms of its social conflict. Volume 2, page 20, in response to Dr. Fate's claim that life is what arises in the clash between chaos and order, John Constantine says, "There's no chaos, no order, just patterns of different levels of complexity." And he would say that because that's his character. I know people aren't so into like essences as a character aspect in Mage, or let alone the metaphysic trinity or the triad, but that statement sums up the questing type of avatar to me, or maybe dynamism caught between entropy and stasis. Rather than perceive the universe as a struggle between chaos and order, Constantine sees expressions of both as the same things. Replace chaos and order with good and evil in his statement, and you get the amorality of mages in a nutshell. I especially like this kind of quote as a dismissal towards a self-important, powerful, famous, high ritualist type. Get Mage back to its punk roots, you know. Volume 3, page 36, Titania tells Tim, while traveling in Fairyland, there are two worlds. Your world, which is the real world, and other worlds, the fantasy. Worlds like this are worlds of the human imagination. Their reality or lack of reality is not important. What is important is that they are there. These worlds provide an alternative, provide an escape, provide a threat, provide a dream and power, provide refuge and pain. They give your world meaning. They do not exist, and thus they are all that matters. So for any mage dealing with the Umbra or any space off Earth, I like that little speech. Earth is defined by its limitations, consensual reality, mortal flesh, etc., and the potential of elsewhere is what draws, or can draw, mages, whether they step sideways to get there, or go on a seeking, or travel forward in time. And the fact that its potential and its kind of phantom, it depends on the mage whether that will lead them to value what they actually have here and now, which I think is a very compelling thing to explore for a character. Finally, Volume 4, page 37, at the end of time, Tim asks the Fool tarot card, who might be John Constantine, might not, what he knows of magic, and the Fool responds, nothing at all, save that a little magic is a most dangerous thing. So Tim has been discovering this fact already, all the way through the series. Again, it's the bitter road. Magic is neither simple nor safe, and part of a mage's hubris is to think that they can make it so. I'm personally a fan of low-powered mage games because I think they can showcase more directly the idea that magic creates more problems, or maybe makes the mage more aware of existing ones, than it can solve. Gain more power, solve some of them, even more will present themselves. If you want to be a little friendlier about it, you can cast it as questions and answers rather than problems and solutions. I don't think the game and its world need to be entirely about that, but I do think it's a disservice to leave it out entirely. Mage should not be a power fantasy unadulterated by consequence and complication. So that's my opinion. There are other things I could point to that are fun. I mean, Volume 4 gets really trippy in showing a technocratic future and some of the alien beings that live there. And I really like the final scene of the mentors having their chat where you see that they're manipulators first, magic users second. And that fits the universe of Mage to a T for me. So those are some of the things that stand out to me.
Although it was written before Mage started, I don't think books of magic influenced the initial concepts of the game. However, the portrayal of powerful practitioners of magic living quietly on Earth can add depth to your games. Beyond just Mage, I think this book can help storytellers portray a number of the secret societies of the World of Darkness. The World of Darkness is built around supernaturals who form societies that they take pains to keep secret. Another thing that made role-playing fans notice the World of Darkness in the 90s was the strong powers that could be used by the players, but always at a price. I recommend this book to World of Darkness storytellers of all stripes. The wizards here make efforts to conceal themselves, but they're active. They move against each other and use their powers on Earth. They just use them with subtlety. The interesting depictions of the lands of Fairy and its residents may have contributed to White Wolf's making their 5th World of Darkness game about changelings. It's impossible to say for sure, but I wouldn't be surprised if Gaiman's writing was one of the factors. Puka, did this book inspire you to change how you run Mage?
Two fairly small and specific things. So first, I don't go in for technocrats much, but I'm always on the lookout for new and interesting ways to run them. We have a cameo by Dr. Terry Robinson, Dr. Terry 13, who is the master debunker whose skepticism makes him resistant to magic. Beautiful. I've tried technocrats as black hat villains. I've tried them as put upon academics trying to just do their best, but now I want to cast them as sardonic, patronizing, and wholly unimpressed by mystics rationalizing away their magic. We'll see how it goes if I try that. And then there's a comment made by Boston Brand in Volume 2 that Constantine gets his power by riding the synchronicity freeway. So it's worth mentioning that Constantine seems to have more direct power than we saw in the early Hellblazer that we talked about, although it's subtle. He's not raising demons and whatnot here, but he has a reputation, enough that he stops a room full of baddies from destroying Tim with threats and bluffs. So my immediate thought is the sphere of entropy and how this might make me rethink it, because I hate when that sphere, or spirit for that matter, gets kind of used as a kitchen sink sphere. Entropy gets more interesting to me the less all-purpose it is. But going back to what kind of mage Constantine is, I'm thinking about how all the different flavors of coincidental magic can dovetail with each other. The practices and instruments that rely on subtlety, and on the character sheet, the value of things like backgrounds, abilities, merits and flaws, the human stuff. Mages are human after all. So when I run Mage, I ask players to create humans first, and then add spheres and bonus dots on top of that, because I want them to think about how their characters overcome obstacles as humans before they fall back onto magic. And I think Constantine models that approach very well. So now I feel like I need to go back and read more Hellblazer and get some ideas for, say, a game where vulgar magic is forbidden outright, or highly risky for some reason. I think that Those are the main things, because the vibe of the series is already something I'm into for running the game in general, so I probably wouldn't change anything on that basis.
I can think of 2 changes for my games I'd consider. First, there are some umbral realms I want my players to visit repeatedly so they can see how they are a meaningful part of the cosmology. Those realms should have unique rules so they stand out in the players' minds. Always do this or never do that. Chapter 3 of this book offers examples to build from. Dr. Occult is unique with his twin souls. He becomes a woman in fairyland, but what if a realm did something similar to its visitors? Every person becomes a member of the opposite sex or becomes a hero they imagined in their childhood. One player becomes a pirate and finds he has knowledge of sword fighting, sailing, etc. Give each player different gear, skill list, and appearance. It could be a great change of pace, but also give insight into the nature of the realm they're in. Second, I want the Shadow Society of Mages to be an engaging part of my games. Chapter 2 gives us rich portrayals of wizards meeting their opponents in the city, but restraining themselves. Keeping their secrets is more important than getting an advantage over their rivals when met by chance. And rival mages should be encountered. The places and resources that matter to mages will give occasion to rub shoulders with others of their kind. A simmering ceasefire gives chances for interesting social interactions. Sandman gave some examples of this, but Books of Magic is about wizards, so the examples are more numerous and useful. Finally, Puka, does this book belong on the recommended reading list, and for what editions?
I'd say it definitely belongs on the list. For editions, I'm tentatively going to say M20 or possibly 2nd edition, because it feels too fanciful to me for revised, plus the fact that they're constantly going through the Umbra, but also not quite gonzo enough for 1st edition. And even though we get hints of a meta plot, it doesn't really come to the fore in a tangible way. It's also worth remembering that we're specifically looking at the journey of an initiate here, and I'm not sure how that impacts things. I mean, Tim certainly isn't being recruited into an overt Ascension War kind of scenario, at least not with particulars that he's aware of, and he's not really inheriting a set tradition or joining a specific group. So maybe an M20 orphan game or something would be what I would think of as the best fit, but it's rich enough that I think anyone could find material for any edition.
Books of Magic is only recommended by 2nd edition Mage books, but I recommend it for all editions. Chapters 3 and 4 won't help your revised edition games, but the first 2 chapters certainly will. Had enough, listeners? Well, you're in luck. We've reached the end of the episode. If you enjoyed it, thanks for listening. If you like content like this, you may be on the Technocracy's watch list, but I'm told the Technocracy isn't real, so no worries. I can finally take this tinfoil hat off. If you hang out on our Discord server, let Puka know you appreciated his insights. For our next episode, should I sample some science fiction by William Gibson, some weird fiction by Robert Chambers, or some manga by Masamune Shiro? An episode on manga may be my undoing, but let me hear what you'd like. Until then, tell your friends about Reality Deviant Book Club. Come for the books, stay for the unhinged ranting. This episode is a part of Mage the podcast until I get a tap on the shoulder. If you would like to let us know what you think, send an email to magethepodcast@gmail.com. You can subscribe to Mage the Podcast on iTunes, Google Play, TuneIn, and other aggregators. If you like the show and don't worry about what others think, you can leave a review online. Those reviews help other people find the show in their searches, and as the folks downstairs say, there's always room for one more. You can follow us on Twitter, @MageThePodcast. We're on the web at magethepodcast.com. We're on YouTube. There's a link in the show notes, but just search for Mage the Podcast, and you'll find us there. If you would like to become an executive producer for this podcast, a link in the show notes will help you do that. No one would blame you for Reality Deviant Book Club. Thanks, everyone, for listening. Until next time, truth until paradox, baby.